Welcome back, friends. One of the more interesting discoveries for us while creating Late in 88 was learning the science of child development, specifically around the middle childhood years and how it echoed our lived experience. Clinical psychologist Dr. Thomson, whom you heard from in episodes 3 and 4, really brought a wealth of knowledge to the conversation and helped us understand that the inner conflicts we experienced were quite normal, even if a little queer. In this third bonus episode, Dr. Thomson takes us by the hand as we explore more of that messy developmental stage.
This idea of the authentic self is something we've talked a lot about. Do you feel like who am I is a question that an 8-year-old could know?
It's definitely still being figured out. To ground this in some theory, one of the big theorists around child development is Erik Erikson, and he talked about this idea of each developmental stage having a big conflict to resolve. And the main conflict in adolescence is around identity. Identity versus role confusion is the conflict. But the building blocks to set us up for that big question of who am I, which we all know does not get answered in one way in one day, are in this stage where industry versus inferiority is the conflict that middle childhood kids are resolving. So it's this idea of how good am I at things and the beginnings of where do I belong. It doesn't mean to say that an 8-year-old has no ability to have a conversation about like true and authentic parts of themselves by any means. Lots of kids are able to do that. But I would think of it more as the building blocks to be able to answer those questions more fulsomely as they get older.
Tell us about the developmental stage of children in grade 4, so ages 8 and 9. What changes for kids at this age?
There's a lot that changes cognitively for kids at this stage. And the biggest shift here is around abstract thinking. So they're able to start to think about and understand symbolism and more theoretical concepts. They start to shift out of pretend play and into more real, concrete, in the moment play. And then they also start to understand more abstract concepts like time and death. And all of these things, as you can imagine, in some ways increase anxiety because it increases amorphousness of the world around us, right? It just gets less contained. They make really big vocabulary leaps. We often talk about vocabulary growing really quickly in early childhood, but there's actually huge, huge leaps that happen in different ways and actually sometimes even in more significant ways for middle childhood because they can start mapping words together and clustering big concepts. So you can have pretty sophisticated conversations with an 8 or 9-year-old that you can't with a 6 or 7-year-old.
We've discovered that most people we've spoken to have said that they didn't really feel like they belonged at this age. Why is that? Because we found ourselves going, did everybody feel like this? Did everybody feel like they didn't belong?
I think that most of us did feel that way. And I think there's a lot of really good reason for it. I don't think it's random. This is the stage where group membership starts to become more and more important in ways that haven't really locked in or keyed in for kids before. I would argue that we all, basically our whole lives, are still figuring out like, who are we and where do we belong? But for an 8, 9, 10-year-old, this is their first draft at this. This is their first experience and it's terrifying. And it often comes with this classic imposter syndrome, this idea that everybody else is getting it but me. Everybody else is fitting in. Everybody else knows how to be cool. Everybody else belongs but me. And there's real reason that that phenomenon happens for us over and over again. I talk about this a lot with my patients in therapy, that we have access to our behind the scenes mess. We know how chaotic it feels inside, how anxious we are. But for everybody else, we get their edited version. We only know really the big mess of our behind the scenes. So we start to, over time, undervalue our own capacity for coping and belonging and overvalue other people's capacities for coping and belonging. Again, that's a generalization. Not everybody falls into that set of experiences, but in general, that happens for us or throughout our lifetimes. And for middle childhood kids, but they don't have the skills to cognitively take themselves out of those rabbit holes. They don't have the skills to gather data and be like, is that assumption about myself really true? Is that really true that that person thinks that about me? These are skills that some adults still don't have. That's one of the big reasons, is this shift from inward to outward and looking to group membership. and it just being really like clunky and especially awkward in those first 10 years. But this is the beginning of it. The other thing that I'd be really remiss to not mention is that parenting was really, really different when we were kids. And it's nobody's fault. We just, nowadays, we have a much more socialized, collective focus on validating feelings, teaching emotion regulation, talking to kids about body autonomy and consent. This was not happening for the majority of our household. That would be an exception if those things were happening for us growing up in the 80s. We had these baby boomer parents that were not equipped with the same resources we now have in books and teachings and models. It's not that it was anybody's fault, but it just wasn't part of mainstream parenting culture. What I'm saying is that middle childhood, yes, starts to feel really scary, but ideally, if kids are still able to return to that safe home base where they get asked about their feelings are believed, their parents get curious and non-judgmental about their experience, that is ultimately what creates the foundation for a sense of belonging and identity. And so the family system and the primary caregivers are still very much part of creating those building blocks so that kids can go towards adolescence with more of a sense of bravery and more of a sense of, okay, I can take a risk here. I can show myself to be my vulnerable, authentic self, because they have that really safe base to go back to. And I think that we're doing a better job of that now, not because we're any better, but because we have access to more and different information. That's a big reason why many of us were starting this tornado of social experiences out in the world. And we didn't all necessarily have that cushion to come back to process what was happening out there.
It's actually really validating to hear you say that, because I do feel like a lot of our conversations, the road comes back to this point of what was happening at home and then how that dictated for each of us our responses to social environments at school. Were you feeling supported at home? Were you feeling safe at home? Were you feeling like it was safe to be yourself?
Yeah.
At this age, does media impact a child's sense of belonging? What that may have included in the 80s and what that looks like now, because obviously media has evolved quite a bit.
One of the other developmental things that happens as a consequence of understanding group membership is kids in middle childhood start to be able to see and understand and predict stereotypes. And this both informs their idea of who belongs where, but also it starts to inform stories about themselves. Who are my people? Who is my safe in group? Obviously today with social media, this looks very different than it did for us in the 80s. But I would argue that the same messaging content was still there around in-group, out-group, gender roles, this whole idea of consumerism, that you're just the right toy or the right lipstick or the right outfit away from being accepted and liked and seen as cool. Those same core problematic messages were there in the shows and movies we watched, the commercials we saw, books we read, video games we played. But I think when you zoom in on messaging around things like social constructs, around like gender roles and heteronormativity and cisnormativity, for sure, those messages came out in the media that we consumed. But they were also echoed in day-to-day community interactions. The grocery teller misgendering the kid. It's the uncle at the dinner table saying boys will be boys. It's the family friend asking the little girl the boy she wants to marry. What media does is it gives this really sped up, centralized message platform. But in general, our media is a reflection of the cultural beliefs and norms and values and worldviews that the community holds. This becomes a little bit of the chicken or the egg phenomenon. I like to think if the masses were in great rejection of what we were seeing in the media, then that's what shapes things over time. I do think that we were still getting those messages. We just didn't have as much access to that ubiquitous all the time media that we have now. I have so many other comments around the effects of social media on child and adolescent mental health when it comes to this idea of how media impacts this developmental age and stage. Sure, I think it's a factor, but it's not the only thing, right? These kids are getting these messages everywhere. Representation and seeing yourself out there, it matters. It really matters.
Wow, that is some incredible research, and certainly makes 8-year-old me feel less like an oddball. We offer a big thank you to Dr. Kate Thomson for all your keen insight. Your contributions to this podcast are priceless. Thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on socials at late.in.88. And if you want more information, you can visit the resources page of our website at latein88.com/resources. Check you later. Meet you at the tire swing.
This podcast is distributed by the Women in Media Podcast Network. Find out more at womeninmedia.network.